Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is how to overcome trauma effectively. And my guest is Dr. W. Lee Warren, author of the book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Dr. Warren, thank you so much for being here. It's our pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Lori. It's great to be with you.
So you are a Christian and a neurosurgeon and have experienced more than your share of trauma throughout your life. So talk about what happened to you, what events in your life led you to come up with this treatment plan for trauma.
Well, the background is I spent half of 2005 in the Iraq War as a combat surgeon in the Air Force. So I experienced a lot of trauma, personally, psychological trauma and medical trauma. But then a few years later, we lost our son Mitchell at 19 when he was stabbed to death. And so in between there, spent a lot of time taking care of people with brain tumors and aneurysms and difficulties. So I just spent a lot of my life around other people when they were hurting. And then as I began to understand how to help them, we went through our, what we call, massive thing of losing our son.
You actually talk about TMT. You use that term a lot, the massive thing. Yeah. And in many people's case, it's the death of a loved one, but it could be a divorce or loss of some sort of a physical function. Talk about some of the massive things that people feel traumatized by.
Yeah, we talk a lot about trauma. Everybody talks about trauma, and it's easy to understand when you get hurt, when you go through something dramatic in your life. And we talk about tragedy, the typhoon, the hurricane, the tornado, but these other massive things, I call it that because not everything that happens to us is a physical diagnosis. Sometimes it's a relational thing, like a divorce, the loss of someone that you care about, or a relationship. Sometimes it's the death of a dream. You've been chasing something your whole life, and then it's not going to happen. We see that with athletes who, they're going to be stars in the NFL, and they tear their ACL and they're not going to play. And what do you do then? So I just wanted to include a category for these injuries that are just as real but aren't as visible.
And you suffered the loss of your child. He was 19, so just barely an adult, which is really one of the most painful things a person can go through, I'm sure. And the loss of a close loved one. So how does a person know when they have been traumatized? I mean, do a lot of people not realize that they are the victims of trauma and just continue to be stuck in that state the rest of their lives?
Well, I think that's a really good point, especially in Christians, because we're always taught so much about, holding on for heaven, and we minimize our own pain, and we sometimes don't sort of give ourselves permission to hurt. But psychologically speaking, when you've gone through a massive event in your life, it creates pathways in your brain that can keep you stuck. And if you don't understand how your brain works when you face these things, then there's really no way forward. And you can spend your whole life sort of suffering and having your life revolving around this event that you've been through. And I want to give people an opportunity to move forward.
So what are the types of things that people experience? In your book, you talk about feeling feeling lost and not having a feeling of control in your life. Can you talk about some of the emotions and thoughts that people who have been traumatized experience on a regular basis?
Yeah, so the first thing is you have this sense that it's never going to change, that you're stuck with it. Your brain tells you all these lies, and the brain chemistry creates all these circuits that make you believe that how you feel right now will never get better. And we're just a testament to the fact that it can get better. But the truth is, your brain begins to create this inevitability feeling in your life that you're stuck with this situation and it's never going to get better. And you have an enemy that wants you to think that too. And of course, God tells us a different story. But from our standpoint, we began to hear all these thoughts in our head. You've lost a child. You can never be happy again. It's never going to be okay again. And then you have to remember, wait, I have a whole other life. I still have a beautiful family and a wife and 4 other children, and there is a path forward for me. So we had to figure out how to unlock that trauma and remember that that's not the end of your story, and you can too.
And I really wanted to sort of drill down on a point that you just made, which is that Satan lies to us. He is the father of lies. And so we need to sort of recognize that we are being lied to when we feel and think certain things. That's really important, isn't it?
That's right. Well, I always say Satan is a cognitive neuroscientist. So he understands how your brain works, and he can help you believe that your brain is telling you the truth when it tells you things like, I'm worthless, nobody will ever love me again, I won't ever be able to recover from this again. Those things are just not true. And God has a set of things that he tells us that are actually true. And there's a difference between a truth that you feel or want to make your truth and what the truth is. And so Satan will tell you whatever version of a story it is to keep you stuck in that place where you can't be effective in the kingdom or you can't find peace in your own life. And the Lord will always lead you to a place of hope and healing. And that's what we found after we lost our son.
It's really just amazing that you are an expert on the brain and also a Christian, because you can combine these two things so perfectly to come, and then also the victim of one of the worst traumas a person can experience, the death of a child. So all these things work together to make you the perfect person to share this message with our audience. And I just wanted to thank you for that. And one of the things that you brought out in your book, which is, I thought, really poignant, was that there's this balance between two things that Jesus said.
That's right. Really, for me, after we lost Mitch, I was struggling and hearing all these things in my head of maybe God's not real, maybe he doesn't love me, and starting to see places looking for inconsistencies or ways to challenge my own beliefs and believe the lie that it was really all is lost. And what I found was that passage in John 16:33 where Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. And then in John 10:10, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. And I found that seems inconsistent. Mm-hmm. But what I figured out is it's very consistent. The truth is God's peace and his power gives you the ability to have two things be true at the same time. You can be in a really hard life with terrible circumstances like our friends in Israel are facing right now. And it can still be true that God is with you, he's beside you, he has a plan for you, and he has a purpose for you in spite of the circumstances that you've been through. And that's the marrying those two things that you can have and not but really turned out to be the secret that helped us start to heal.
A lot of people not only feel when they suffer trauma that God doesn't love them, but a lot of people even take it one step further and say there is no God, there couldn't be a God who would allow something like this to happen to me or in general. Talk about those faith challenges that people feel right away after a trauma.
Well, it's universal that major events will challenge your faith. They will, because whenever we face difficult circumstances, our first impulse is to individualize it. And what I realized is when you face something really hard, it would be unfair if you were the only one facing something hard. But even Jesus faced the completely unfair and unjust accusations and trial and ultimate execution that happened to him, and it wasn't fair. So if it only happened to me, if it only happened to you, it would be unfair. But the fact is, these things happen to everyone. All of us go through these massive things. And the beautiful thing is, God says, because this world is so hard, thank goodness I have a better plan for you than that. Thank goodness there's more to this story than just the circumstances you face. And so when you start to feel those things, like God isn't real, God doesn't love me, zoom out a little bit and say, wait a minute, everybody else is suffering too, and God's already taken care of it. There's a long arc to this story, and it ends on hope.
And hope is so important. It's just as important as the air we breathe. We are going to talk about the importance of hope and how to regain hope if you've lost it from a tragedy that you've experienced. We're going to take a break and continue our discussion with Dr. W. Lee Warren, author of the book, Hope is the First Dose. Stay with us.
Stay connected with CBN News all day across our platforms.
Welcome back to Healthy Living. We are continuing our discussion with Dr. W. Lee Warren, author of the book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. And right before the break, Dr. Warren, you were talking about hope. How important is hope as far as our happiness and our peace?
Well, hope is everything. Medical research actually has shown us that hopelessness is deadlier than cancer. If you lose hope, you really can't make it through anything. And even if you survive, your quality of life will be wrecked. So hope turns out on the medical side to be the most important aspect of healing and recovery from anything that we go through. On the spiritual side, we figured out that hope is really the only thing that can turn the lights back on when you face these impossible circumstances. circumstances. So the ability to have hope and believe that God has a plan and a purpose for you is what starts to unlock the chains that are holding you down in this stuck position. So researchers have done all this work on defining what hope is, and from the scientific standpoint, they say it's agency and pathways. So what they mean by that is agency is the ability that you have to do something about the circumstance you're in. So you have some ability to move forward. And pathway is you have some plan or some ability to think about what the future might look like so that you can get there from here. And what I found as I was looking through the Bible is it always turns out to be memory and movement. It's a verb. So hope is not an accident. People can actually create hope if they remember. You can see it all throughout the Old Testament, David and Asaph, throughout the Psalms. If you remember what God has done in the past, reclaim and recall his promises to your mind, and then you begin to move towards them as if they were already true for you, and that reliably produces hope. It worked for us when we lost our son. That's how we flexed those muscles of memory and movement and found hope again.
How does a person know when they've lost hope? What are some of the symptoms? I know a lot of us feel sort of numb and just kind of like just move through the day like zombies. I have had my share of trauma as well, and so have experienced that, and I'm sure that's pretty common. How does a person know if they have lost hope?
Well, I think the first thing we need to say as a disclaimer, the first thing is this kind of healing doesn't happen overnight. You have to give yourself permission to absorb the blow of the wound, and there will be a period of time, just like after you have major surgery. That's not the time to go to physical therapy. You have to recover for a little bit first. But there comes a time when I think it's the Holy Spirit that tells you, hey, it's time to start moving forward a little bit. And in the early days, it might be that's the day to brush your teeth again, or it's the day to get out of bed and not just watch television today. But there will come a time when you know in your heart that it's time to start moving forward, and if you can't, that's when you might be stuck. And sometimes that requires therapy or medicine or a visit to the doctor. Sometimes it just requires somebody coming alongside you. Like I had Lisa, my wife, come alongside and say, hey, it's time for us to start trying to heal again. It's time for us to start moving forward again. And if you can't, that's when you need some help.
How long does it take a person to grieve, kind of depending on their situation? Like, let's say you lost a loved one, or let's say you had a divorce. You know, you talk about the loss of a dream. I know some people who wanted to be, you know, moved to Hollywood and wanted to be an actress, and that didn't work out. I mean, those types of things. How long do people typically grieve before they need to really start getting back into the land of the living?
Well, I think that's an important question, and I might surprise you with the answer. There's not a time that's right for everyone, because suffering happens to all of us, but we grieve alone. Like your process will be different than anybody else's process. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model that we all know when we're taught in school, the 5 stages of grief, it's a little unfortunate that we've applied that to all types of grief, because her research was specifically about what people do when they find out that they're dying. So she looked at a specific group of people, and when you learn the news that you have terminal cancer, you behave in a sort of predictable way. But that grief model does not apply to what happens when you lose your husband, or when you go through a divorce, or when your son is stabbed. And the point is, you'll grieve at a rate that's different than somebody around you. And so don't start a clock and make yourself feel like today's the day I have to get better, and go through that acceptance process. It's different for everybody.
Right. One thing that I really loved that you brought out in your book were the 4 types of people based on the ways that they handle trauma. And I've noticed this too. Many of us have, when certain things happen, people handle it in different ways. And you say they're untouchables, climbers, dippers, and crashers.
Right.
Crashers are the worst.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, so there's a group of people. I just started modeling, looking at it as a scientist. How do people handle hard things? And I was actually doing that research when we lost our son. So I thought I knew all this stuff about how people handle trauma, and then our son died, and I was one of those people. But the crashers are the people who, they seem like everything's okay, and they have faith, and then something bad happens, and it wipes them out, and they lose hope, and they never get better. And you know this person. You bump into them at the grocery store, and their husband left them 25 years ago, and it's still all they can talk about.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Their life is defined by that massive thing that happened to them. And it's sad, but it's become the defining thing of their life. And this other group, untouchables, equally frustrating to me, are these people that seem like nothing ever phases them. I'm not one of those people. That, you know, they've got their faith together, they know what they believe, and something happens, and it seems to just roll off of them. And I can't understand those people, but I'm glad they're out there. I'm not one of them. The most common group, I think, are probably like me. me what we call dippers. You know, life hits you hard, it wipes you out for a while, you question God, you shake your fist, and then you find your faith. The floor holds on your hope, and you remember who you are, you remember who God is, and you start to climb back up and you find your way again to that place that looks like hope and maybe even happiness again. And the most surprising group are the ones that we call climbers, this group of people that have no faith, no hope to start with, that their life has been really hard. And then somehow that event, that massive thing, turns them around and they find hope and faith and happiness. And the challenge that they face turns out to be the thing that they needed to help them find happiness in the end. I had a patient named Joey, I wrote about in my second book, who had brain cancer, and his life before that had been devastatingly hard. But he said to me as the last year of his life played out that it was the best year of his entire life because he fell in love, he found Jesus, he found that people loved him. And so even though his physical body was dying, he came alive in that last year of his life because of hope.
That is absolutely amazing and so inspiring. This whole book is very inspiring, and there's a graph of those 4 different people and where they start out and how they end, which is really interesting. We're going to take another quick break and be right back with Dr. Lee Warren. The book is called Hope is the First Dose. Stay with us. Welcome back, and we're talking about a plan to overcome trauma, and unfortunately, Dr. Warren, hardly any of us can escape it, right? It's something, especially as we get older, that so it's nice to know ahead of time, whether you've been through trauma or not, to know how to deal with it properly.
That's right. No, we don't know any 200-year-old people, so unfortunately everybody's going to face these massive things of one sort or another. So it's important, I think, to have a plan. You know, it occurred to me as we were starting to put the thoughts together that turned into this book that we have a plan for what we're going to do if we have a flat tire, and we learn how to operate defibrillators in case somebody has a heart attack, and we even teach kids in school how to stop, drop, and roll if they catch on fire, right? But none of us have ever caught on fire, but we have a plan for what we're going to do if it happens. But we don't really ever plan ahead for major emotional trauma. And I thought, how silly is that? When we all face it, we all go through hard things, we need a treatment plan. And that's what I tried to give people in the book.
I think one of the main takeaways for me from this book, and this is something that we read about in the Bible, but sometimes don't make the connection, we have the ability to control our thoughts. The Bible talks about taking your thoughts captive. But a lot of people don't realize that we can control our thoughts. A lot of people feel like we're just complete victims to the things that pop into our head and ruminate in our minds, and we really don't have any power to control them. Oh, I just can't stop thinking about this, we say. But that's not true at all, and that's really one of the main points of your books, is that we need to direct our thinking.
That's right. We call it self-brain surgery. It's what we talk about on my podcast all the time. It's this idea that you have 40,000 negative thoughts a day. Most of them aren't true. You have all kinds of feelings that aren't true. Feelings are chemical events in your brain that may or may not point towards something true. And since your thought life is so overwhelmingly negative and so overwhelmingly untrustworthy, you need to figure out a plan for how you're going to interrupt those thoughts. Paul calls it taking your thoughts captive in 2 Corinthians 10:5. And that's the idea that you don't have to listen to every idea that pops into your head. And I teach this little thing I call the bad thought biopsy, where if you can just take a second to listen to the feeling and listen to the thought that you're having and put some space in there and examine whether or not the thought is true or helpful or kind or compassionate to yourself before you decide how to respond to it. That's when the Holy Spirit will step in. He's a gentleman, he's quiet, but he'll step in and say, hey, turn that thought into something helpful. And even if it's true, sometimes you hear thoughts that are true. I have lost a son, and sometimes those thoughts are, you're always going to be sad and devastated about that. That's true. But watch out for the second thought, because the second thought is the one where he says, and since you've lost your son, you don't even need to try to parent your other kids, because who are you to say what they should do since you couldn't keep your other son safe? That's not true. But the devil will try to make that second thought, he disarms you with the first thought that is true, and you got to watch out for the second thought. So learning that thought biopsy, that self-brain surgery idea, is how you take your thoughts captive. And it turns out to be what the Holy Spirit was telling us all along when he says in Romans 12:2, that if you can transform your thinking, you'll change your life.
We want to talk quickly, though, about, you touched on it a moment ago, about some of the physical things that happen to our bodies when we're traumatized. Sometimes we have difficulty sleeping, and what are some other things?
Well, I can tell you in my own life, I developed shingles a few days after Mitch died. I was a young, healthy guy, had shingles in my back. I developed gray hair. I cracked all the molars in my mouth from grinding my teeth. The guy in Lamentations that talks about how God broke his bones and ground his teeth to dust, that's the physical manifestations of trauma. Your body breaks when your brain breaks. When you think when you go through extreme stress and you have extreme negative thought toxicity, it turns into physical changes in your body. So C.S. Lewis said after his wife died, nobody ever told me grief felt like fear. And that's what happens. You're hurting, you're grieving, and you feel the same set of emotional things that you feel when you're afraid. Your heart races and your skin turns cold and the hair rises up on the back of your neck. It's the physical manifestations of trauma. So understanding that you're not going crazy, that your body's reacting because you have a limited palette of neurotransmitters to tell the story of what you're feeling. Kurt Thompson says you sense something and then you make sense of what you sense. So you feel it, and then if you're not careful, you'll think that that feeling means a certain thing because of your previous experiences. But instead, you take the thought captive, you turn it around, you examine, understand what's going on in your body, and then you turn it into positive thought that you can not silly optimism, but positive ways that you can navigate the situation with God's help to make progress in your life back towards hope.
All right. Well, we're going to take another break and be right back with Dr. Lee Warren, author of the book, Hope is the First Dose. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We are continuing our discussion with Dr. W. Lee Warren, author of the book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Unfortunately, doctor, we are about out of time, but I really wanted to give you an opportunity to let our viewers know where they can find out more about you. You have a podcast where you discuss religion and science, faith and science, which is one of my passions, how to combine these two things. Can you talk about what other, your website and things, and your podcast?
Sure, the Dr. Lee Warren podcast, everywhere you listen to podcasts, we almost every day talk about cognitive neuroscience and faith and how we smash those things together in what we call self-brain surgery. Then, of course, the book and all my books are available everywhere books are sold, but my website is just my name, drleewarren.com, and we love for people to connect. We interact with our listeners and readers all the time, and it's been a great honor to try to help people.
And you are in private practice as well in Nebraska, right?
That's right.
And you do mostly spine surgery?
Brain and spine surgery, yeah.
Well, you're a busy man.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much for being here. It's our privilege to have you, and the book is fantastic and a wonderful tool for all people. Once again, the book is called Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Dr. Warren, great to be with you today.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you for tuning into this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week.